In a kingdom veiled by frost and whispers, Snow White was born under a blood moon, her skin pale as snow, her heart untouched by fear. The queen, adored for her beauty, ruled with a fragile crown until jealousy rooted itself in her soul. Rumors spread of a mirror that didn't lie, a magic that spoke truths no one dared confess. And the mirror spoke Snow White's name. Years passed. Snow White grew graceful, fearless, and mysterious as the dark woods that skirted the castle walls. Villagers spoke of her kindness, how dire wolves calmed at her feet, how light bent toward her. Yet in the queen's chambers, beauty was measured in reflection, not compassion. One dawn, with frost on her breath, the mirror declared Snow White the fairest of them all. The queen's eyes narrowed. Her heart, once gilded, curdled with envy. And so a hunt began, not for survival, but for annihilation. Snow White, unsuspecting, walked toward destiny with every step. The forest noticed her before she noticed it. Branches bent inward as Snow White crossed the tree line, shadows stretching like fingers trying to warn her. Behind her, the castle bells rang, not in celebration, but command. The queen had spoken. A huntsman followed, boots crushing frost, hand tight around a blade that had ended lives before. This time was different. This time, the order tasted like ash. Snow White felt it. That pressure in the chest. The sense of being watched. She turned once, just once, and their eyes met between the trees. The huntsman froze. Years of loyalty shattered under the weight of her gaze. She didn't beg, didn't run. She simply waited. And that was worse. "Go," he whispered, voice breaking. "Run and never look back." The blade fell from his hand. She ran. Branches tore at her dress. Thorns kissed skin. Breath burned. Behind her, something else moved. Not the huntsman. Something older. Watching. Learning her scent. When she finally collapsed by a stream, trembling and alone, Snow White didn't know the truth yet. The queen wasn't done. Night fell without mercy. The forest changed its voice after dark. What had whispered now growled. Snow White followed the stream until moonlight fractured on the water, leading her to a crooked cottage crouched between roots and stone. Smoke curled from its chimney. Warmth. Life. She knocked once. Silence. Then the door creaked open. 7 faces stared back. Scarred, tired, cautious. Not children, not legends. Men shaped by exile and labor, eyes sharp from living where the world forgets you. They didn't bow, didn't smile. They studied her like a storm, deciding whether to pass or strike. Inside, the air smelled of iron and earth. She ate in silence, listening. These men knew the queen's reach, knew what happened to those who drew her envy. When Snow White spoke her name, the room went still. One candle died. No wind. That night, as she slept by the fire, dreams clawed their way in. A mirror cracking, a crown sinking into blood-soaked snow, and a voice, not the queen's, whispering her name like a promise. Morning would bring safety, or war. The apple was never meant to kill her. That was the lie everyone believed. The queen needed something worse. She needed Snow White to sleep while the world burned around her. Disguised in rags and wrinkles, the queen crossed the forest alone, magic coiled beneath her skin like a second spine. The cottage welcomed her with silence. The men were gone. Mining. Too easy. Snow White answered the door with trust still intact, eyes bright, heart unguarded. The queen smiled. A perfect smile. Poison hidden behind sweetness. One bite. Snow White gasped. The world tilted. Sound stretched thin, like it was being pulled away from her. She fell, not in pain, but confusion, as if something inside her was being locked behind glass. When the men returned, they found her cold and breathing, barely, not dead, trapped. They laid her in crystal, afraid to bury what still lived. Far away, the mirror cracked, because the truth had finally surfaced. Snow White wasn't fair because of beauty. She was fair because she carried magic older than the queen ever was, and the queen knew it. Time didn't stop for Snow White. It twisted, bent, watched. Inside the crystal, she drifted through memories that weren't hers. Crowns forged before kingdoms, forests bowing to a girl with snow in her hair, a magic that chose vessels, not bloodlines. She saw the queen as she once was, afraid, small, desperate to be seen. That desperation had turned to hunger, and hunger always consumes. Outside, the forest sickened, crops failed, rivers darkened. The men felt it in their bones. The queen was tearing the land apart, trying to force the magic to answer her. And it wouldn't. It never would. Then one morning, hoofbeats shattered the silence. A stranger stood before the crystal cloak, torn, eyes haunted. He didn't see a relic. He saw a heartbeat. He touched the glass. It cracked. Snow White inhaled like she'd been drowning for years. And somewhere, the queen screamed. The queen felt her before the ravens screamed. Magic recoiled inside the castle, candles guttering as if afraid. Snow White was awake. Worse, she was aware. Not a girl running anymore. A force returning to its shape. The forest rose with her steps. Trees leaned aside. Stone warmed beneath her palms. The stranger followed, sword useless, knowing this battle wasn't meant for steel. When the castle gates loomed, the queen stood waiting, crown sharp as thorns, mirror shaking behind her. "You were never chosen," the queen spat. Snow White didn't argue. She reached out. The mirror screamed as it shattered, truth spilling like light. The queen aged in seconds, beauty collapsing into fear, into nothing. Power abandoned her. Always had. When silence fell, Snow White stood alone in the ruins. But power never leaves without a cost. The kingdom didn't cheer when the queen fell. It breathed. Snow White walked through the wreckage slowly, feeling the land pull back from the edge with every step she took. Power drained from her fingers, from her chest, from the place where the forest had once spoken so clearly. Magic was never meant to be owned, only carried. And only for a while. She chose to let it go. The stranger watched as the last light faded from her touch, leaving behind something quieter. Stronger. Human. The forest healed without command. Rivers cleared on their own. Balance returned, not because it was forced, but because it was allowed. Snow White never wore a crown carved in gold. She ruled by walking among her people, by listening, by remembering what jealousy had destroyed. The mirror shards were buried deep, where no one could hear them whisper again. And in winter, when snow fell soft and clean, the kingdom remembered her not as the fairest of them all, but as the one who ended the curse by refusing to become it. The shadow hanging over Snow White 2025 isn't cast by an evil queen, it's cast by history. This is the film that has to wrestle with Disney's own origin story, the 1937 Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, a movie that didn't just launch a studio, but practically invented the animated feature as we know it. Remaking that isn't a creative decision, it's a philosophical one. And that's exactly why Disney handed the project to Mark Webb, a director whose entire career has orbited one idea. How do you retell a familiar story so it feels emotionally contemporary without snapping the spine of what made it resonate in the first place? Webb's resume explains the choice. 500. Days of Summer wasn't a rom-com so much as a dissection of romantic myth-making. How stories we inherit shape our expectations and quietly sabotage us. His Amazing Spider-Man films leaned hard into intimacy over spectacle, framing a global superhero inside the awkward body language of first love and loss. That instinct matters here. Snow White 2025 was never going to succeed by being louder, darker, or bigger than the original. Its gamble is quieter, reframing innocence not as passivity, but as moral clarity in a world built on control. From the earliest production notes, Webb positioned this film less as a remake and more as a reinterpretation. The studio language danced around words like modernization, but the real shift lives in perspective. The 1937 Snow White exists in a moral universe where goodness is rewarded because it is pure. Webb's version asks a tougher question. What does goodness cost when power actively punishes it? That distinction shapes every creative choice downstream, from character emphasis to visual tone. This isn't about replacing a fairy tale. It's about interrogating why that fairy tale still matters and where it no longer fits. Disney's live-action strategy looms large here. After the hyper-literal Beauty and the Beast, the revisionist Maleficent, and the visually maximalist The Little Mermaid, the studio faced an identity crisis. Audiences were tiring of shot-for-shot nostalgia, yet backlash flared whenever changes felt ideological rather than organic. Snow White 2025 arrives as a stress test. Webb's mandate was clear but precarious: honor the emotional memory while justifying the film's existence as a new work of art. That's a narrow bridge. One misstep and the film collapses into either museum piece reverence or hollow provocation. What anchors Webb's vision is his focus on agency, not in the blunt, slogan-ready sense, but in behavior. This Snow White isn't defined by rebellion for rebellion's sake. She listens. She observes. She chooses her moments. Webb frames her morality as active resistance, not inherited virtue. In interviews, he's spoken about wanting to reclaim kindness as strength, a counter-narrative in an era that often equates empowerment with domination. That philosophy reframes the central conflict. The Queen isn't just jealous of beauty here, she's threatened by a worldview she cannot control. Visually, Webb leans into contrast rather than spectacle. Where the animated classic glows with storybook warmth, this film reportedly uses texture-weathered stone, imperfect light, lived-in spaces. The forest isn't merely a place of fear, it's a moral crossroads. The castle isn't just grand, it's suffocating. These choices reflect Webb's grounding instincts as a director. He's less interested in fantasy as escape than fantasy as escape than fantasy as emotional metaphor. Every environment becomes an extension of power dynamics, subtly reinforcing who holds control and who resists it. This approach also explains why Disney resisted handing the project to a more bombastic stylist. A Tim Burton Snow White would have leaned gothic. A high-concept auteur might have chased provocation. Webb's strength is restraint. He stages emotion in close-ups, in pauses, in the space between dialogue. That matters in a story so deeply ingrained in collective memory. The film doesn't need to shout its differences, it needs to earn them. Of course, none of this exists in a vacuum. Snow White 2025 was conceived amid cultural arguments about representation, authorship, and the ownership of myth. Webb's challenge wasn't to avoid those conversations. It was to metabolize them into the film's DNA, rather than letting them sit awkwardly on the surface. The result, by design, aims to feel inevitable rather than reactionary. Whether it succeeds is a question for later chapters, but the intent is unmistakable. This is a Snow White shaped by listening to the past without being imprisoned by it. And that's the quiet confidence of Webb's creative genesis. He doesn't approach Snow White as sacred text or ideological battleground. He treats it as a living story, one that survives precisely because it can change shape. Yet a director's vision is only the spark. The real test comes when that philosophy meets the page, where fairy tale abstraction has to become structure, dialogue, and narrative momentum. Because before Snow White could be reimagined on screen, she had to be rewritten from the ground up. Fairy tales feel timeless because we absorb them before we're old enough to question structure. But once you start pulling at the seams, Snow White becomes deceptively strange. A girl survives because she's kind. Evil announces itself through vanity. Love arrives like fate, not choice. For the 2025 adaptation, the script had to answer a dangerous question: how do you preserve the mythic simplicity without insulting a modern audience's intelligence? The answer, for better or worse, lives in the writing. The screenplay went through a long public evolution. Disney didn't rush this. Early drafts leaned closer to the animated template, preserving familiar beats almost intact. Those versions stalled, not because they were bad, but because they didn't justify their own existence. The breakthrough came when the writers reframed the story's engine. Instead of asking, "How does Snow White survive?" they asked, "Why does her worldview threaten the Queen?" That shift sounds small. It changes everything. Suddenly, the narrative isn't reactive, it's ideological. This version of Snow White still draws from the Brothers Grimm, but selectively. The Grimm tale is harsher, more punitive, obsessed with moral consequence. The 1937 film softened that into warmth and musicality. The 2025 script threads a needle between them. Consequences return, but cruelty isn't fetishized. The danger feels systemic rather than cartoonish. The Queen's power isn't just magic, it's political. Control of labor. Control of narrative. Control of who gets to be seen. Snow White's threat comes from refusing to play along. Structurally, the screenplay stays classical. 3 acts. Clear escalation. No experimental fragmentation. That's deliberate. The writers understood that formal familiarity gives them permission to innovate within character. Act 1 establishes a kingdom obsessed with surfaces, mirrors, rituals, hierarchy. Snow White's early scenes emphasize observation over action. She watches how people are treated. She notices who disappears. This patience is crucial. It refrains her later choices as earned rather than impulsive. When she finally acts, it doesn't feel like rebellion. It feels like inevitability. Dialogue became one of the trickiest balancing acts. The original film speaks in archetypes, pure, declarative language designed for children. Modernizing that without sliding into irony was the real danger. The solution was restraint. Characters speak simply, but not stupidly. Snow White doesn't announce her goodness. She asks questions. She listens longer than expected. The Queen, meanwhile, speaks in controlled precision. Every line is about ownership of beauty, of truth, of destiny. Their verbal rhythms never align. That disconnect becomes the subtextual battleground. One of the most significant departures from earlier versions lies in how the script handles romance. The prince is no longer a narrative reward that arrives at the end. He's introduced earlier, positioned less as savior and more as contrast. Where Snow White believes in communal responsibility, he represents inherited power struggling with conscience. Their relationship grows out of shared observation, not destiny. Love here is alignment, not rescue. The kiss, still present, carries thematic weight rather than fairy tale inevitability. It's a choice, not a spell. The Dwarfs, reimagined and heavily debated, serve a different narrative function as well. In earlier tellings, they exist to protect and humanize Snow White. In this script, they mirror the kingdom's marginalized labor force. Each character embodies a different response to oppression, withdrawal, anger, humor, compliance. Snow White doesn't fix them. She learns from them. That reversal matters. It positions her not as moral superior, but as moral participant. Leadership emerges through listening, not command. Tone management might be the script's quietest achievement. This story flirts constantly with darkness. Exile, attempted murder, authoritarian control, but refuses nihilism. The writers clearly resisted the temptation to grimdark, the fairy tale. Hope remains central, but it's harder won. Scenes linger on aftermath. Silence stretches. Victory never feels clean. The result is a script that trusts younger audiences with emotional complexity without abandoning accessibility. That's a rare balance. Of course, not every choice will land universally. Some viewers will miss the breezy simplicity of the animated original. Others will argue the script still doesn't go far enough, but the intention is coherent. This Snow White isn't about updating symbols to check boxes. It's about reassigning narrative weight-shifting power from fate to choice, from purity to courage, from beauty to conviction. The writing does the heavy lifting so the film doesn't have to explain itself later. Because once the script locked this foundation, everything else followed naturally. Casting stopped being about resemblance and started being about presence. Performances shifted from iconography to interiority. The story demanded actors who could communicate thought before action, conflict behind stillness. And that's where the project entered its most visible and controversial phase. Because once words become flesh, interpretation becomes unavoidable. Casting Snow White 2025 was never going to be a quiet process. You don't cast one of the most culturally loaded characters in cinema history without igniting debate. Disney knew this. Mark Webb knew this. And the casting team leaned into that inevitability rather than trying to dodge it. The guiding principle wasn't resemblance to an animated icon. It was alignment with the film's redefined core, presence over prettiness, interior strength over decorative innocence. The role of Snow White demanded an actor who could carry stillness without emptiness. This version of the character spends much of the film observing, listening, measuring the world before acting within it. That's a hard needle to thread. Too passive, and she disappears. Too assertive, and the fairy tale gravity collapses. The search reportedly focused on performers with musical ability. This is still a Disney musical, but more importantly, with expressive restraint. Someone whose face could hold contradiction, hope and fear, compassion and resolve. Casting wasn't about making Snow White louder. It was about making her legible. Rachel Zegler's eventual selection made sense inside that framework, even if it felt combustible outside it. Her breakout performance in West Side Story proved she could anchor a classic reimagined without being swallowed by legacy. More crucially, she projects sincerity without fragility. There's steel under the warmth. Zegler's screen presence doesn't ask for permission. It invites trust. That distinction matters. This Snow White isn't waiting to be discovered. She's already paying attention. The casting team leaned into that energy, betting that conviction would outlast controversy. The evil queen posed a different challenge. This character can't function as pantomime villainy anymore, not in a film grounded in systemic power. The queen needed authority before cruelty, glamour before menace, someone who understands how power performs itself. Gal Gadot's casting plays directly into that calculus. Her screen persona carries mythic confidence, the kind that fills space before dialogue lands. The queen doesn't rage here. She curates. Every movement is controlled, every expression calibrated. Gadot's physicality, upright, composed, untouchable, turns vanity into ideology. What's fascinating is how deliberately the casting avoids symmetry. Snow White and the Queen don't mirror each other visually or vocally. They operate on different frequencies. That asymmetry reinforces the film's thematic engine. This isn't a battle between equals. It's a confrontation between control and conscience. Gadot's Queen dominates rooms. Zegler's Snow White changes them. Casting becomes storytelling. The supporting ensemble was assembled with similar intention. The Dwarfs, reconceptualized as a collective of marginalized figures rather than cartoon archetypes, required actors who could embody specificity without collapsing into gimmick. Each role represents a different survival strategy under authoritarian rule. Casting emphasized texture over familiarity, faces that feel lived in, voices that carry weariness, humor, frustration. The goal wasn't instant likability. It was credibility. These characters needed to feel like people shaped by systems, not mascots designed for comic relief. Chemistry testing played a quiet but decisive role across the ensemble. Webb's direction depends heavily on unspoken dynamics, the way characters listen, interrupt, withdraw. Traditional screen tests focused less on line delivery and more on interaction rhythms. Who leans in? Who holds back? Who fills silence? Those micro-behaviors determine whether the film's ideological conflicts feel embodied or theoretical. Casting here wasn't about star power. It was about relational architecture. The prince, or more accurately, the reimagined romantic counterpart, underwent similar scrutiny. This role couldn't default to fairy tale perfection. He needed moral uncertainty. Someone who benefits from power structures yet feels their weight. Casting prioritized actors capable of self-questioning on screen. Charm alone wouldn't cut it. The character's arc depends on recognizing complicity without collapsing into guilt. That's a narrow emotional bandwidth. Get it wrong and the romance becomes hollow. Get it right and it becomes thematic reinforcement. Behind the scenes, the casting process reflected Disney's broader recalibration. After years of leaning on nostalgia casting faces that echo animated originals, the studio finally allowed Divergence to do narrative work. That decision carries risk, but it also signals confidence. The film isn't asking audiences to accept change blindly, it's asking them to feel coherence. When casting aligns with story philosophy, the conversation shifts from "why them" to "of course them." Not every choice was designed to be comforting. Some were meant to provoke recalibration. That's intentional. Fairy tales survive by adaptation, not preservation. Casting is the most visible expression of that truth. It's where abstraction becomes human, where ideology acquires eyes and voice and breath. Webb understood that if audiences believed the people, they'd follow the reimagining, even when it challenged expectation, and that belief ultimately rests on performance. Casting can only promise potential. The real test arrives when actors step into costume, space, and silence, and begin building character from behavior rather than symbolism. Because once the faces are set, the question shifts, not who they are, but what they do with it. And that's where Snow White 2025 reveals its most delicate work inside the performances themselves. Some performances announce themselves. Big gestures, vocal fireworks, emotional crescendos designed to be noticed. Snow White 2025 goes the other way. Its acting lives in restraint, in what's withheld, delayed, quietly processed. That makes the performances easy to underestimate on first glance. It also makes them far harder to pull off. This film doesn't reward theatricality. It rewards control. Rachel Zegler's Snow White is built from stillness. Not emptiness, stillness with intention. Early scenes position her as a listener rather than a reactor. Watch her eyes. They move before her body does. She absorbs rooms, measures tone, registers cruelty without immediately responding to it. That behavioral choice defines the entire arc. Snow White's strength isn't defiance, it's clarity. Zegler understands that playing goodness doesn't mean playing sweetness. It means playing awareness without cynicism. That balance is brutal. She nails it. The performance refuses easy sentimentality. When Snow White shows compassion, it isn't accompanied by musical swelling or emotional telegraphing. Zegler often underplays moments where other versions leaned hard into innocence, a half smile instead of delight, a pause instead of a speech. That restraint allows the character to evolve organically. By the time Snow White begins making decisive choices, the audience isn't surprised. They've watched her thinking for an hour. Action feels like release, not transformation. Vocally, Zegler avoids the trap of theatrical purity. Her singing, still luminous, feels grounded rather than operatic. Songs emerge from character rather than spectacle. She sings like someone processing belief, not declaring destiny. That distinction matters. This Snow White doesn't exist to inspire through perfection. She inspires through consistency. Zegler's voice carries warmth, but it also carries resolve. Steel under silk. Always. Gal Gadot's Queen operates on the opposite axis. Where Snow White opens outward, the Queen contracts inward. Everything about Gadot's performance is about control, posture first. She enters scenes already composed, already dominant. Even silence bends around her. Gadot understands that true authority doesn't need to perform anger. It performs certainty. The Queen's menace comes from how little she needs to raise her voice. Power is assumed, not asserted. The brilliance of Gadot's work lies in precision. She rarely overplays vanity. Instead, she plays fear of irrelevance. Watch the micro-adjustments. The slight tightening of the jaw when admiration shifts away from her. The delayed blink when challenged. These aren't accidents. They communicate a woman who understands her image is armor, and who panics when that armor shows cracks. The mirror isn't just a prop. It's her feedback loop. Gadot treats it like a judge she can never quite satisfy. When the Queen finally erupts, emotionally rather than theatrically, the effect lands harder because of all that suppression. Rage here feels earned, not decorative. Gadot avoids cackling villainy. What she gives instead is something colder, contempt disguised as elegance. That choice grounds the character in recognizably human insecurity. This isn't evil for evil's sake. It's control terrified of displacement. The dynamic between Zegler and Gadot never becomes a shouting match. That's key. Their scenes play like ideological standoffs rather than emotional explosions. Snow White doesn't confront the Queen head-on. She undermines her by existing differently. Gadot plays the Queen as someone who senses this threat long before it becomes visible. The tension lives in anticipation, not collision. Two performances circling each other, never syncing rhythm. The romantic counterpart, reimagined and deliberately understated, adds a third performance axis. He isn't heroic in the traditional sense. He's observant, conflicted, quietly complicit. The actor plays him with deliberate hesitancy. Confidence flickers, then recedes. This isn't indecision. It's conscience learning to speak. Scenes between him and Snow White crackle, not with passion, but with alignment. Their chemistry isn't fireworks, it's calibration. Watching two people realize they're asking the same questions. The supporting ensemble deepens this emotional architecture. Each of the reimagined dwarfs carries a distinct behavioral rhythm. One deflects with humor. Another withdraws into labor. Another simmers with anger barely contained. None of these performances push for scene-stealing moments. They exist as counterpoints to Snow White's approach to resistance. Watching her interact with them feels less like leadership training and more like mutual recognition. The actors play weariness convincingly, not cartoon fatigue, existential exhaustion. It grounds the film. What's striking across the board is how little the performances rely on dialogue, meaning emerges from behavior. Who stands? Who sits? Who interrupts? Who waits? Mark Webb's direction gives actors space to think on screen, and they use it. Silence isn't dead air here. It's information. You're invited to read faces rather than be told what to feel. That trust elevates the entire film. Not every viewer will respond to this approach. Those expecting high-emotion theatrics may find the performances muted, but that restraint is the point. Snow White 2025 treats its characters as people navigating systems, not symbols fulfilling destiny. Zegler and Gadot, in particular, understand the assignment. They don't perform fairy tale. They perform belief. And belief, once established, shapes everything around it. Performance informs production design. Body language influences camera movement. Emotional restraint dictates visual texture. Acting doesn't sit on top of this film, it anchors it, which makes the next layer inevitable to examine, the world these performances inhabit. Because characters, this internal demand, a physical space that listens as closely as they do. Great lead performances can dominate a film. Great ensembles make it breathe. Snow White 2025 understands that distinction, and its supporting cast is engineered not to orbit the heroine, but to exist independently of her. These characters don't exist to validate Snow White's goodness. They exist to complicate it. That choice quietly reshapes the entire emotional ecosystem of the story. The reimagined dwarfs, less a novelty concept than a narrative correction, form the film's moral chorus. Each represents a different survival response to systemic control. One works relentlessly, believing safety comes from usefulness. Another masks despair with humor sharpened into defense. Another withdraws entirely, mistrusting hope as a luxury. None of them are wrong. That's the point. Their performances aren't broad or cute. They're grounded, weary, specific. You feel years pressing down on their posture before they ever speak. What makes the ensemble work is refusal to sentimentalize marginalization. These characters aren't waiting to be rescued. They've already adapted. Snow White enters their world as an interruption, not a savior. The actors play this resistance beautifully. Trust isn't given easily. Suspicion lingers in eye contact. Conversations stop when she enters rooms. The ensemble doesn't soften just because the protagonist arrives. They test her. That tension elevates every shared scene. Chemistry among the group feels lived in rather than staged. Conversations overlap. Humor lands awkwardly. Silences stretch. These are not people who perform unity. They endure together. The actors build a believable collective history through behavior alone. Shared glances imply arguments we never saw. Small gestures suggest compromises long settled. This is ensemble work rooted in restraint, and it gives the film a textured emotional floor beneath its mythic ceiling. The romantic supporting role operates as connective tissue rather than narrative engine. He isn't positioned above or below Snow White, but alongside her, moving at a different pace. His performance leans into uncertainty. He watches before speaking. He hesitates before acting. That hesitation becomes thematic reinforcement. This is a character benefiting from inherited power who slowly recognizes the cost of neutrality. The actor plays this arc without grand confession scenes. Change registers in posture, tone, and the courage to finally stay rather than flee. The Queen's inner circle courtiers, guards, enforcers, serve a different ensemble function. They embody institutional complicity. These performances are intentionally muted. No mustache-twirling villains here, just people doing jobs, following orders, avoiding eye contact. Their ordinariness is chilling. Evil doesn't announce itself, it normalizes. The actors understand this and play it straight. That choice sharpens the Queen's power. She doesn't rule alone. She rules through people who've decided comfort matters more than conscience. What's impressive is how these supporting performances never feel like thematic mouthpieces. The actors avoid telegraphing symbolism. Instead, meaning emerges through contrast. Watch how differently characters respond to Snow White's kindness. Some lean in, others recoil, others remain unmoved. The ensemble creates a spectrum of belief rather than a unified reaction. That variety prevents the film from slipping into moral simplicity. Goodness isn't universally persuasive. Sometimes it's inconvenient. Sometimes it's threatening. The childlike energy traditionally associated with Snow White's companions is intentionally absent and replaced with something riskier: dignity. Humor exists, but it's dry, situational, defensive. Laughter arrives as release, not entertainment. This tonal shift may alienate viewers expecting whimsy, but it gives the film emotional credibility. These characters don't exist for cuteness. They exist because systems produce survivors in different shapes. Mark Webb's direction allows the ensemble to occupy space without constant narrative justification. Scenes linger on interactions that don't advance plot, but deepen relationship. A shared meal, a wordless exchange, a disagreement left unresolved. These moments build trust between film and audience. You're allowed to observe rather than be instructed. The ensemble doesn't rush to harmony. It earns proximity slowly. The cumulative effect is subtle but powerful. By the time Snow White begins to influence the world around her, the audience understands what's at stake because they've come to care about the people already living with the consequences. Change isn't abstract. It threatens fragile equilibrium. The supporting cast makes that clear without ever saying it aloud. This is ensemble work doing narrative labor. It contextualizes heroism, grounds ideology, and resists simplification. Snow White's journey matters more because it unfolds among people who challenge it, resist it, and eventually, selectively, choose to engage with it. That choice feels earned because the performances are patient. And patience is the connective tissue of this film. It extends from acting into environment. These characters feel shaped by the spaces they inhabit, their homes, their workplaces, their margins, which brings the conversation naturally to the physical world itself. Because once an ensemble feels real, the sets can't be decorative. They have to carry history. Fairy tales live or die by their worlds. If the environment feels artificial, the myth collapses into costume drama. Snow White, 2025, understands this at a granular level. And its production design is where the film quietly does some of its most persuasive storytelling. This isn't a kingdom built to impress. It's a kingdom built to function, and that decision reshapes how every scene lands. The castle is the clearest statement of intent. Gone is the romanticized fantasy architecture of soaring spires and glowing halls. This version is imposing, angular, and deliberately constricting. Stone dominates. Corridors narrow unexpectedly. Windows are tall but stingy with light. You feel hierarchy before it's explained. The Queen's power isn't just asserted through performance. It's embedded into the walls. Production design here works like political geography. Who gets space? Who gets light? Who gets warmth? Those answers never change. The Queen's chambers are particularly revealing. Mirrors recur, but not as decorative flourishes. They're positioned as tools, objects of assessment, surveillance, and self-discipline. Surfaces are polished to near sterility. Color is minimal, leaning into cold metallics and deep blacks. Nothing feels lived in because nothing is allowed to age. The room resists entropy. That resistance mirrors the Queen herself. Control expressed architecturally. Perfection as a prison. Snow White's environments tell a different story. Early scenes place her in transitional spaces, hallways, thresholds, edges of rooms rather than centers. She exists in motion, rarely settled. As she moves away from the castle, the world gains texture. Wood replaces stone. Imperfection appears. Cracks. Uneven surfaces. The production design doesn't romanticize poverty or exile, but it allows for breath. Light behaves differently here. It scatters instead of obeying strict lines. Nature isn't idealized, but it's responsive. The forest, a location that's often reduced to fear in earlier versions, becomes something more complex. It's not purely threatening or comforting, it's indifferent. Trees crowd the frame not to scare, but to obscure certainty. Paths aren't clear. Shelter exists, but only if you learn how to see it. The designers avoid storybook symmetry. Branches don't arch politely. Moss grows where it wants. This forest doesn't care if you survive, but it allows the possibility. That neutrality reinforces the film's thematic shift away from destiny. The dwellings of the supporting ensemble feel assembled rather than designed. Materials don't match. Repairs are visible. Tools are repurposed. This is lived-in design, not curated grit. The spaces suggest history without exposition. You can tell where someone sleeps, where they eat, where arguments have happened. These environments carry the weight of endurance. The production design refuses prettiness in favor of plausibility. That restraint pays off emotionally. When Snow White enters these spaces, she isn't stepping into refuge. She's stepping into reality. Costume design works in concert with the sets rather than fighting them. Snow White's clothing evolves subtly, not through dramatic makeovers, but through practicality. Fabrics change before colors do. Movement becomes easier. Garments adapt to labor. There's no sudden hero outfit moment. Empowerment here looks like preparedness. The Queen's costumes, by contrast, remain rigid. Structured silhouettes. Limited mobility. Beauty maintained through restriction. Even visually, power and freedom never coexist in the same frame. Color palette choices reinforce this philosophy. The film resists high saturation. Reds matter because they're rare. Whites carry weight because they're fragile. Darkness isn't stylized. It's functional. Shadows fall where light can't reach, not where the camera wants drama. This grounded approach gives the story credibility. When beauty appears, it feels earned. When ugliness appears, it feels honest. One of the most effective design choices lies in repetition. Certain visual elements recur across locations: chains, reflective surfaces, enclosed frames, creating subconscious continuity. These motifs aren't announced, they're felt. The audience begins to associate enclosure with authority, openness with vulnerability. Openness with vulnerability. Production design becomes narrative shorthand. You don't need dialogue to understand shifts in power. The space tells you. What's impressive is how invisible all this feels while watching. That's the mark of confident design. Nothing screams for attention. Nothing begs to be admired. The world simply exists, coherent and indifferent to spectacle. In a Disney live-action era, often criticized for visual excess, Snow White 2025 opts for discipline. Less glow. More weight. This restraint also gives the cinematography room to breathe. Cameras can linger because the spaces support observation. Movement feels motivated because geography makes sense. Blocking becomes storytelling rather than logistics. Production design doesn't decorate scenes, it enables them. By the time the film reaches its later movements, the world feels internally consistent enough to hold moral consequence. When power shifts, it shifts spatially. Rooms change function. Spaces open or close. You feel transformation before it's articulated. That's design doing narrative labor at the highest level. And once a world is this carefully constructed, how it's captured becomes crucial. Texture, shadow, distance all depend on the eye behind the lens. Because production design builds the stage, but cinematography decides what we're allowed to see. Cinematography is where Snow White 2025 reveals how disciplined its storytelling really is. This isn't a film that uses the camera to decorate emotion. It uses the camera to observe it. Every framing choice, every movement, every withheld flourish reinforces the same central idea. Power constrains, conscience navigates. The visual language favors clarity over spectacle. The camera rarely announces itself. No indulgent swoops, no restless movement searching for energy. Instead, shots are composed with intention, often holding longer than expected. That patience does real work. It allows performances to unfold without interruption and gives the audience time to read faces, environments, and relationships simultaneously. You're not told where to look. You're trusted to notice. Early scenes inside the castle establish a strict visual grammar. Frames are symmetrical, centered, and boxed in. Characters are often shot straight on or from slightly below eye level, reinforcing hierarchy. The queen frequently occupies the center of the frame, with others arranged around her like extensions of architecture rather than independent figures. The camera doesn't move because power here doesn't need to adjust. It's fixed, immutable. Watching these scenes feels controlled, almost clinical, and that discomfort is intentional. Lighting inside the palace follows the same logic. Illumination is directional and selective. Faces emerge from shadow only when permitted by space or status. The queen is consistently well lit, her features sculpted to emphasize authority. Others fall into partial darkness, their expressions obscured. This isn't moody lighting for atmosphere's sake, it's visual hierarchy. Light becomes permission. Once Snow White leaves that environment, the cinematography loosens, but never becomes chaotic. The forest sequences introduce handheld elements, but sparingly. Movement is gentle, observational, as if the camera itself is learning how to exist without rigid rules. Depth of field opens up. The world feels less imposed and more discovered. Focus shifts more frequently, allowing background details to breathe. This visual openness mirrors Snow White's expanding moral agency. One of the film's smartest visual decisions lies in how it handles distance. Snow White is often framed slightly off-center, especially in transitional moments. She occupies thresholds, doorways, edges of clearings, margins of rooms. The camera respects that liminality. It doesn't push her into dominance prematurely. When she finally commands the center of the frame later in the film, the shift lands emotionally because it's been withheld for so long. Composition becomes character arc. Close-ups are used with restraint. When they arrive, they matter. Faces fill the screen not during speeches, but during listening. Reactions, not declarations. The camera lingers on eyes processing information rather than mouths delivering dialogue. This choice aligns perfectly with Rachel Zegler's performance style. Her Snow White thinks before she acts. and the cinematography honors that interiority instead of rushing past it. The Queen's visual treatment remains consistent and revealing. Even in moments of vulnerability, she's rarely shot from above. The camera refuses to diminish her physically, even as her control begins to fracture psychologically. When cracks appear, they're expressed through framing rather than angle. Reflections multiply. Mirrors distort perspective. The Queen is still powerful, but no longer singular. The image fractures before the character does. Camera movement becomes more fluid as collective action emerges. Group scenes later in the film introduce lateral motion, slow tracking shots that follow characters moving together rather than isolating individuals. This is visual solidarity. The camera no longer prioritizes one figure dominating space. Instead, it shares attention. That evolution is subtle but cumulative. You feel power redistributing before the narrative confirms it. Color temperature also plays a quiet role. The castle's cold palette gives way to warmer tones without ever tipping into comfort fantasy. Warmth here isn't safety, it's humanity. Firelight flickers inconsistently. Shadows remain. The film resists the temptation to brighten hope visually. Instead, it lets warmth coexist with uncertainty. That honesty keeps the fairy tale grounded. Visual effects integration deserves mention precisely because it avoids dominance. Magic exists, but it doesn't hijack the frame. Effects are composited to feel tactile rather than spectacular. The mirror, for instance, doesn't glow constantly or demand attention. It appears when summoned, then recedes. Magic behaves like power in this film, present, potent, but controlled. That choice keeps the cinematography from being overwhelmed by digital noise. Perhaps the most telling aspect of the film's visual strategy is what it refuses to do. No frenetic editing to manufacture urgency. No extreme angles to signal drama. No visual shorthand screaming, "This matters." Instead, the cinematography trusts narrative accumulation. Meaning builds through repetition, contrast, and absence. That confidence is rare in modern studio filmmaking. This approach won't thrill viewers seeking kinetic fantasy, but it will reward viewers paying attention. The camera isn't trying to impress you. It's trying to align you with Snow White's perspective, with the cost of power, with the slow courage of choosing differently. Cinematography here functions as moral posture. And when visuals are this measured, sound becomes the emotional amplifier. Silence, music, and ambient texture step forward to fill the space the camera leaves untouched. Because once the eyes have absorbed the world, the ears take over guiding feeling where images remain restrained. Music in Snow White 2025 doesn't sweep you off your feet. It circles you, waits, tests when to step forward and when to disappear entirely. That restraint is the film's defining sonic philosophy, and it's a risky one, especially for a Disney musical built on some of the most recognizable songs in cinema history. Instead of leaning on nostalgia as a safety net, the film rethinks how music functions emotionally, politically, and psychologically. The score operates less like a narrator and more like a nervous system. It reacts rather than dictates. Themes don't announce themselves in bold statements. They surface tentatively, often unfinished, as if still deciding whether they belong. This approach immediately signals intent. The film doesn't want music to tell you what to feel. It wants music to sit beside you while you feel it. Snow White's musical identity reflects her interiority. Her early songs are gentle but unresolved, structured around incomplete melodic phrases that never quite land where you expect. That lack of resolution mirrors her position in the world. Present, observant, but not yet empowered to conclude anything. The music doesn't soar because she hasn't. Vocally, the arrangements give Rachel Zegler space rather than spectacle. Her voice isn't buried under orchestration, it's exposed. Breathing between lines matters. Silence between notes matters even more. As Snow White's agency grows, so does musical confidence, but incrementally. There's no sudden anthem announcing transformation. Instead, motifs repeat with subtle alterations. Tempo firms up, harmonies thicken, Rhythmic certainty replaces hesitation. You feel progression rather than being told it exists. That slow evolution respects intelligence. It assumes the audience can track emotional change without fireworks. The Queen's sonic world couldn't be more different. Her themes are rigid, symmetrical, and controlled. Percussion enters with military precision. Low strings hold tension without release. Even moments of beauty feel sterile, as if polished too carefully to trust. The music doesn't rage. It dominates. That dominance becomes unsettling over time. Repetition without variation turns oppressive. Power, expressed musically, reveals itself as stagnation. The Mirror's sound design deserves special attention. Rather than overwhelming scenes with heavy effects, the Mirror's presence is marked by subtle distortion, slight reverberation shifts, faint harmonic dissonance, a texture that feels wrong without drawing attention to itself. The sound seems to press inward rather than expand outward. It's invasive. The Mirror doesn't shout truth. It insinuates it. That choice reinforces the Queen's relationship with it. Not as a mystical advisor, but as an echo chamber. One of the film's most confident moves lies in its use of silence. Not empty silence, loaded silence. Scenes linger without score where other films would panic and cue strings. Conversations end without musical punctuation. Footsteps echo longer than comfortable. Breath becomes audible. These moments force attention inward. You're not distracted by emotional cues. You're left alone with implication. Silence here functions as moral pressure. When classic songs reappear, they're treated carefully, almost reverently, but never slavishly. Familiar melodies are rearranged, sometimes stripped down to their emotional skeletons. Lyrics land differently when context shifts. A line once played for innocence now carries irony. A melody once carefree now feels fragile. The film trusts the audience's memory and uses it against expectation. Nostalgia becomes subtext rather than selling point. The supporting ensemble's musical moments reinforce community rather than individuality. Group numbers don't build toward show-stopping crescendos. They ebb and flow, voices entering imperfectly, sometimes clashing, sometimes harmonizing. That roughness feels intentional. Unity isn't instant, it's negotiated. The music reflects that negotiation. When harmony finally settles, it feels earned rather than imposed. Sound design outside of music remains understated but deliberate. Environmental sounds carry narrative weight. The castle hums faintly even in quiet moments, an almost imperceptible reminder of constant surveillance. The forest sounds differently depending on perspective. At first, branches snap too loudly. Wind overwhelms. Later, those same sounds soften into rhythm. The environment hasn't changed. Snow White's relationship to it has. Audio mixing reinforces the film's psychological priorities. Dialogue remains clean, but never overly present. Voices don't dominate space unless power demands it. The Queen's words often arrive with acoustic clarity, cutting through rooms. Snow White's voice initially blends into environment, emerging gradually as her confidence grows. Even without looking, you could track character evolution by volume and placement alone. What makes the film's sonic landscape work is humility. The music doesn't compete with image or performance, it supports them, enhances without explaining. In a genre prone to excess, Snow White 2025 chooses discipline. That discipline gives emotional moments room to land without manipulation. And yet, none of this restraint diminishes impact. If anything, it sharpens it. When the score finally swells, rarely, intentionally, it feels seismic because the film has taught you to listen closely. You've been trained to notice absence, so presence hits harder. But crafting this level of sonic precision doesn't happen by accident. It emerges from process. Long days, recalibration, discarded ideas, and unexpected solutions. Which brings us behind the curtain to the making of the film itself. Because stories about power often reveal their truth in how they're created. Every film develops a public narrative. Snow White 2025 developed two. The one audiences saw, debates, headlines, think pieces, and the one that unfolded quietly on set, where the actual work of making the movie happened. The disconnect between those narratives says a lot about how this film came into being, because behind the noise was a production defined less by chaos than by recalibration. From the outset, the shoot was designed to be deliberate rather than fast. This wasn't a production racing toward spectacle. Mark Webb structured the schedule to protect performance and environment, even when that meant slower days and fewer setups. Scenes heavy on dialogue or silence were given breathing room. Actors weren't rushed through emotional beats. That patience became a quiet form of resistance against the industrial pressure surrounding the film. Make it louder. Make it faster. Make it safer. Make it safer. Webb kept choosing, make it honest. The castle interiors were among the earliest sequences shot, and that order mattered. Starting in the Queen's domain allowed the production to lock in the film's emotional baseline: control, rigidity, surveillance. Actors and crew have spoken about how oppressive those sets felt after long days. Low light, enclosed corridors, cold materials. That discomfort wasn't accidental, and it wasn't wasted. Performances absorbed it. By the time filming moved into more open environments, the contrast felt earned rather than designed. Weather became an unexpected collaborator during the forest shoot. Rather than fighting inconsistency, the team leaned into it. Light shifted unpredictably. Fog rolled in when it wasn't scheduled. Rain interrupted takes. Instead of forcing continuity, the production adapted blocking and camera placement to accommodate natural variation. The result is a forest that feels alive rather than staged. You sense unpredictability because the crew experienced it too. Those conditions informed pacing, movement, even performance energy. Rachel Zegler's process on set was notably internal. She didn't approach Snow White as a role to be projected outward. Between takes, she stayed quiet, observant, often watching others rather than retreating to isolation. That behavior mirrored the character and subtly influenced group dynamics. Scenes gained authenticity not because she performed leadership, but because she earned trust through presence. Webb allowed that to happen organically, instead of manufacturing moments. Gal Gadot's preparation moved in the opposite direction. Precise, controlled, ritualized. She worked closely with costume and movement teams to restrict her physicality intentionally. Heavy garments weren't treated as obstacles, but as tools. Limited mobility informed posture. Posture informed authority. Even between takes, Gadot often remained composed, maintaining the Queen's dominance as a kind of muscle memory. That consistency made the power imbalance feel continuous rather than performative. One of the more revealing behind-the-scenes dynamics involved restraint. Specifically, what didn't make it into the film. Several sequences reportedly leaned darker in early cuts, pushing the Queen further into explicit cruelty. Test screenings suggested those moments weakened the film's core tension. Fear became obvious. The solution was subtraction. Scenes were trimmed, reframed, or removed entirely. Threat became implication. The film trusted atmosphere over explanation. That editorial discipline reshaped the final tone. The mirror sequences underwent similar evolution. Early visual effects passes leaned too heavily into spectacle. Glow, distortion, overt supernatural signaling. Webb pushed back. He wanted the mirror to feel invasive, not impressive. Effects were dialed down. Sound design took precedence. The mirror became something you feel before you see. That shift emerged from collaboration rather than mandate, and it's one of the film's most effective refinements. The ensemble cast bonded less through rehearsed camaraderie and more through shared constraint. Long days. Uncomfortable conditions. Scenes that demanded stillness instead of release. That collective endurance translated on screen. Group scenes carry an unspoken familiarity that doesn't come from chemistry reads alone. It comes from time, from waiting together, from negotiating silence. There were, of course, moments of pressure. Public discourse seeped into the edges of production, especially as casting controversies intensified online. Disney shielded the set aggressively, limiting exposure and redirecting focus inward. Webb's approach was simple. Control what you can control. The work, the frame, the behavior. Actors weren't asked to respond to narratives they didn't create. They were asked to show up and do the job. That insulation preserved creative focus during a volatile release window. Reshoots inevitable on a production of this scale were targeted rather than corrective. No third-act overhaul. No tonal panic. Adjustments centered on clarity, tightening pacing, sharpening character motivation, refining transitions. That restraint speaks volumes. The film wasn't rescued in post, it was refined. That difference matters. Perhaps the most telling behind-the-scenes choice was the refusal to chase consensus. The production understood early that Snow White 2025 wouldn't please everyone. Rather than sanding down edges, the team committed to coherence. Decisions were judged internally by alignment with the film's moral spine, not by predicted reception. That's a dangerous strategy in franchise filmmaking. It's also the only way a reinterpretation like this survives with identity intact. By the time cameras wrapped, the film that existed bore little resemblance to the one people argued about online. It was quieter, stranger, more patient, built from accumulated choices rather than headline moments. The production journey didn't eliminate controversy, but it clarified intent. This wasn't a movie made by algorithm or appeasement. It was made by people choosing restraint in an industry addicted to noise, and that makes what came next inevitable. Once the film left the controlled environment of the set, it entered the uncontrolled arena of commerce. Numbers replaced nuance. Perception hardened into metrics. Because, no matter how carefully a film is made, it ultimately faces the same question. How did the world respond when tickets went on sale? Box office is where intention meets indifference. Theaters don't care why a movie was made, only whether people showed up. Snow White 2025 entered that arena carrying more baggage than most releases, and its commercial performance can't be understood without acknowledging that reality. This wasn't just a film launch. It was a referendum on Disney's live-action strategy, on cultural fatigue, on how much patience modern audiences still have for reinterpretation. Disney positioned the release carefully. Wide rollout, premium formats, family-friendly calendar placement. On paper, the strategy looked familiar, but the atmosphere wasn't. By the time tickets went on sale, the conversation surrounding the film had hardened into camps. Curiosity and resistance coexisted uneasily. That split defined opening weekend behavior. Audiences didn't drift in casually. They arrived with opinions, or stayed home because of them. The opening frame reflected that tension. Attendance was solid rather than explosive, signaling interest without frenzy. This wasn't a four-quadrant event dominating culture for a weekend. It was a measured turnout shaped by debate. Families came. So did younger viewers drawn by curiosity rather than nostalgia. What was missing was universal consensus. The sense that everyone needed to see this immediately. The film opened respectably, not triumphantly. What mattered more was the second weekend. That's where Snow White 2025 revealed its true commercial identity. Drops were softer than expected. Not because marketing suddenly improved, but because word of mouth stabilized. Viewers who connected with the film advocated for it quietly. Not through viral hype, but through recommendation. The audience wasn't loud, but it was steady. That steadiness kept the film afloat long after initial discourse cooled. International markets told a slightly different story. Regions less immersed in Western online culture responded more to the fairy tale framework than the surrounding controversy. Attendance abroad leaned into curiosity and visual appeal rather than ideological framing. The film's grounded fantasy translated better than expected, particularly in territories where Disney fairy tales retain mythic rather than nostalgic status. Global performance didn't erase domestic ambivalence, but it contextualized it. Merchandising, often a bellwether for Disney's confidence, was noticeably restrained. No overwhelming product blitz. No aggressive character branding. This wasn't an accident. The studio seemed aware that the film's tone didn't lend itself to maximal commercialization. That choice limited ancillary revenue, but protected brand coherence. Better a quieter shelf life than mismatched marketing noise. Streaming performance later reframed the conversation. Once the film entered home viewing spaces, resistance softened. Without the pressure of participation in a cultural argument, audiences engaged with the film on its own terms. Completion rates were strong. Repeat viewings emerged slowly. This wasn't a background movie. It required attention. Those who gave it that attention tended to respond favorably. Over time, streaming allowed the film to find its actual audience, smaller than Disney blockbusters of the past, but more invested. Financially, Snow White 2025 landed in an uncomfortable middle space. Not a failure, not a phenomenon, a reminder that prestige reinterpretation and mass appeal don't always align neatly. For Disney, that outcome carried implications. It suggested diminishing returns on nostalgia alone, but also cautioned against assuming controversy automatically converts into curiosity. Attention doesn't equal attendance. That lesson is expensive, yet numbers alone don't tell the whole story. The film's box office performance reflected its identity. This was never designed to be disposable comfort viewing. It asked something of its audience. Time, patience, engagement. Those qualities don't spike opening weekends. They accumulate, slowly, quietly, over time. In industry terms, Snow White 2025 became a data point rather than a blueprint. It didn't kill the live-action fairy tale. It didn't save it either. It complicated it. Studios watching closely saw that audiences will follow reinterpretation, but only when it feels internally coherent. Half measures fail louder than bold ones. Commercial impact also showed up in subtler ways. Talent perception shifted. Rachel Zegler emerged not just as a breakout singer, but as a performer willing to anchor difficult material. Mark Webb reasserted his reputation as a director drawn to character over noise. The film's financial ambiguity didn't diminish those outcomes. If anything, it clarified them. In the end, the box office story of Snow White 2025 isn't about dollars alone. It's about friction. About what happens when a studio known for certainty releases a film comfortable with ambiguity. The numbers reflect that discomfort. They also reflect endurance. This film didn't burn bright and vanish. It lingered. And lingering is where cultural judgment begins to shift. Because once commercial dust settles, another force takes over: criticism, conversation, reassessment. The box office closes its books quickly. Culture keeps reading. Critical reception is where Snow White 2025 finally became the film it was always going to be. Divisive, argued over, slowly recontextualized. Reviews didn't land in unison. They fractured. And that fracture tells you more than any aggregate score ever could. Early reactions split along expectation lines. Critics approaching the film as a nostalgia object tended to recoil. They wanted color, speed, reassurance. What they found instead was patience, restraint, and moral ambiguity. For those viewers, the film felt muted, almost evasive. The absence of overt whimsy registered as loss rather than intention. The most common critique in these circles wasn't that the film failed, but that it refused to behave. Others responded to that refusal with relief. These reviews focused less on comparison to the 1937 original and more on internal coherence. Praise centered on tone control, performance restraint, and thematic discipline. Several critics highlighted Mark Webb's unwillingness to overcorrect, to replace old simplicity with new bombast. The film's quiet confidence became its defining virtue for supporters. They didn't call it revolutionary. They called it thoughtful. That distinction matters. Rachel Zegler's performance emerged as the closest thing to consensus. Even skeptical reviews acknowledged her control. The praise wasn't effusive, it was precise. Words like measured, intentional and anchored, surfaced repeatedly. Critics who disliked the film often singled her out as the reason it held together at all. That kind of acknowledgement carries weight. It suggests durability beyond momentary discourse. Gal Gadot's Queen generated more polarized response. Some critics admired the restraint, reading her composure as chilling. Others wanted more overt menace, more theatricality. The divide mirrored the film's broader tension, whether subtlety reads as sophistication or distance. Neither side was wrong. They were responding to different contracts with the genre. The film refused to resolve that tension, and critics reflected it back. Audience reception followed a similar pattern, but with an interesting delay. Initial audience scores skewed lower, influenced heavily by pre-release narratives. Over time, those numbers crept upward. Post-theatrical viewing shifted perception. Without the pressure of cultural participation, viewers engaged more generously. Online discussions softened. Conversations moved from outrage to interpretation. That arc hostility to curiosity to reevaluation is increasingly common for films that resist instant gratification. Social media reaction told two different stories simultaneously. Loud negativity dominated early cycles, driven by algorithmic amplification rather than sustained engagement. Quieter appreciation followed later, often long-form, reflective, analytical. Threads discussing visual language, thematic choices, and performance nuance gained traction weeks after release. The film didn't win the meme war. It won the slow conversation. Awards attention was modest but pointed. No sweeping campaigns. No major category dominance. Instead, targeted recognition. Music, design, performance acknowledgement from critic circles. These weren't coronations. They were signals. The industry recognized craft even if it hesitated to celebrate ambition publicly. In a year crowded with louder contenders, Snow White 2025 occupied an awkward middle ground, too restrained for spectacle awards, too mainstream for art house reverence. What's most revealing is how criticism evolved over time. Early reviews framed the film as a statement. Later reassessments framed it as a study. That shift reflects distance from noise. When controversy cooled, the work itself remained. Viewers noticed patterns, motifs, intentional withholding. The very qualities criticized as dullness began to read as confidence. Cultural response also exposed fatigue, not just with remakes, but with outrage itself. By the time discourse circled back, many viewers were simply tired of being told what to think about a fairy tale. That exhaustion worked in the film's favor. It allowed space for individual response. Some loved it, some didn't. Fewer felt compelled to perform either reaction loudly. In the broader Disney live-action canon, Snow White 2025 already occupies a strange position. It isn't the most successful. It isn't the most beloved. But it might be the most argued over in terms of intent. Critics and audiences alike sensed that this film was trying to do something specific, and judged it based on whether that specificity resonated, not whether it pleased everyone. That's a healthier critical ecosystem than it often appears. Not consensus, but clarity of disagreement. Films that generate that kind of response tend to age interestingly. They don't disappear. They resurface. Rewatched without expectation. Reevaluated without pressure. Which raises the final question, the one that outlasts box office, reviews, and discourse cycles. What does Snow White 2025 ultimately say? And what, if anything, does it leave behind? Because legacy isn't built in opening weekends. It's built in meaning. Legacy is the wrong word for most modern studio films. They arrive, dominate a weekend, and evaporate into content libraries. Snow White 2025 resists that life cycle, not by being monumental, but by being stubbornly specific. Its final impact doesn't come from what it changes, but from what it reframes. This is a film less interested in rewriting a fairy tale than interrogating why that fairy tale still circulates. At its core, the film is about power, how it's inherited, how it's maintained, and how it panics when confronted by something it can't control. The Queen believes power is singular. centralized, reflective. She needs validation because her authority has no moral root. Snow White, by contrast, operates without spectacle. She doesn't seize control, she disperses it. That ideological clash is the film's true engine, and it plays out quietly, scene by scene, choice by choice. One of the film's most striking thematic moves is its rejection of destiny. Earlier versions of Snow White function on inevitability, goodness rewarded because it is pure. This film argues something more uncomfortable. Goodness survives because it adapts. Snow White isn't protected by fate. She's protected by attention, empathy, and the willingness to endure uncertainty without becoming cruel. That's a harder lesson. It doesn't flatter the audience. It challenges them. Beauty, traditionally the story's currency, is demoted here. The Queen's obsession with appearance reads as desperation, not threat. Beauty without substance becomes hollow. Snow White's influence, meanwhile, comes from consistency rather than allure. The film doesn't deny beauty. It contextualizes it. What matters isn't how you're seen. It's how you behave when no one is watching. That shift reorients the entire moral framework of the story. There's also a quiet political reading embedded beneath the fairy tale surface. Systems persist, not because they're strong, but because people adapt to them. The supporting ensemble embodies this truth. Survival strategies vary. None are framed as moral failures. The film resists easy hero-villain binaries beyond the Queen herself. Complicity is treated as human, not monstrous. Change, when it arrives, feels collective rather than victorious. Power doesn't fall. It erodes. That erosion defines the ending's emotional tone. The film doesn't explode into triumph. It exhales. Resolution arrives without fireworks. Some viewers found this unsatisfying. Others found it honest. The ending doesn't promise utopia. It promises possibility. Snow White doesn't inherit a perfect world. She inherits responsibility. That's the film's final statement, and it's a risky one for a genre built on closure. In Mark Webb's career, Snow White 2025 fits neatly alongside his fascination with internal transformation over external conquest. Like 500, Days of Summer, it dismantles romanticized narratives without mocking them. Like The Amazing Spider-Man, it privileges emotional specificity over franchise expectation. This film won't be remembered as his biggest. It may be remembered as his most disciplined. For Disney, the film represents a crossroads. It exposes the limitations of live-action nostalgia while hinting at a path forward, one that treats fairy tales as evolving myths rather than fixed products. Whether the studio follows that path remains uncertain. But Snow White 2025 proves it's possible to reinterpret without erasing, to modernize without sneering at the past. Rewatchability will be selective. This isn't comfort cinema. It's contemplative. Viewers seeking escapism may never return to it. Viewers drawn to mood, performance, and thematic restraint likely will. Over time, the film's reputation may stabilize not as a crowd pleaser, but as a conversation piece, a version of Snow White that asks more than it gives. So who is this film for? It's for audiences willing to meet a fairy tale halfway. For viewers curious about what happens when innocence is treated as intention rather than ignorance. For those open to quiet power instead of spectacle. It won't convert skeptics. It doesn't try to. It offers coherence instead. In the end, Snow White 2025 doesn't replace the 1937 classic. It stands beside it, arguing across decades. One celebrates purity. The other examines persistence. Both believe goodness matters. They just disagree on how it survives. That disagreement is the film's legacy. Not unanimity, not dominance, but dialogue. And for a story that has been told for centuries, that might be the most faithful adaptation of all. The most revealing thing about Snow White 2025 may be what it refuses to resolve. Even after its narrative closes, the film leaves behind unanswered tensions. Ethical, emotional, cultural. That discomfort isn't accidental. It's structural. This is a story designed to linger in the gaps rather than seal them shut. Look at how authority is handled in the final movements. Power doesn't vanish with the queen. It decentralizes. Responsibility spreads outward rather than upward. That choice quietly subverts centuries of fairy tale logic, where evil is externalized and removed like a tumor. Here, the implication is more unsettling. Systems don't end when tyrants fall. They mutate. They wait. Snow White's challenge isn't victory, it's vigilance. That idea reframes her character retroactively. She isn't a reformer crowned by destiny. She's a caretaker stepping into unfinished work. The film's last emotional note isn't triumph or romance, but obligation. That's a daring endpoint for a Disney fairy tale. It replaces fantasy resolution with moral continuity. The story doesn't end. It hands the burden forward. This reframing changes how the film sits within modern fantasy cinema. Contemporary blockbusters often equate empowerment with domination. Bigger battles, louder declarations, clearer villains. Snow White, 2025, rejects that grammar. Its vision of power is relational, fragile, reversible. Influence spreads through consistency, not conquest. That's not a crowd-pleasing philosophy. It's a patient one. This patience explains why the film resists meme culture. There are no single scenes designed to go viral. No punchline moments engineered for instant circulation. Meaning accumulates instead of spikes. In an attention economy built on immediacy, that's borderline rebellious. The movie doesn't want to be clipped. It wants to be considered. That refusal positions Snow White 2025 closer to revisionist fantasy literature than modern blockbuster cinema. Think Ursula K. Le Guin rather than Marvel. Power as responsibility. Leadership as listening. Change as erosion instead of explosion. These aren't ideas that trend. They persist. And persistence may be the film's quiet victory. Over time, it's likely to be discovered rather than defended, found by viewers outside the initial noise cycle. Rewatched not because it's comforting, but because it's clarifying. Films like this don't build fandoms quickly. They build them slowly, through recognition rather than hype. There's also something revealing about how younger audiences respond to it. Children don't experience the film as controversy. They experience it as tone, as mood, as behavior. Snow White listens. She waits. She doesn't rush to punish. For some viewers, that's boring. For others, it's grounding. The film models a version of strength rarely centered in children's media, steadiness. That may be its most radical gesture. Not updating iconography, not reframing romance, but presenting patience as power in a cultural moment addicted to immediacy. That's not nostalgia. That's counter-programming. Which raises a larger question, not about this film, but about the genre itself. If fairy tales are meant to evolve, what do they evolve toward? Louder spectacle? Sharper ideology? Or quieter ethics? Snow White 2025 offers one possible answer. Not the only one, not the definitive one, but a coherent one. And coherence, in modern franchise filmmaking, is rarer than ambition. The film may never be universally loved. That was never its destiny. But it may become something more durable, a reference point. A reminder that reinterpretation doesn't have to scream to justify itself. Sometimes, it just has to mean something different. And trust the audience to feel the difference. And that trust, that's where the story really leaves us. Because once a fairy tale stops reassuring us, it starts asking questions. What Snow White 2025 ultimately exposes isn't just a shift in fairy tale storytelling. It exposes an audience divide that studios rarely admit exists. Not between old and new. Not between progressive and traditional. But between viewers who want stories to resolve anxiety and viewers who are willing to sit inside it. This film is built unapologetically for the second group. That choice explains why reactions often hinge on pacing rather than plot. The film doesn't rush toward reassurance. It lingers in uncertainty. Scenes stretch past comfort. Decisions are delayed. Silence replaces exposition. For some viewers, that reads as inertia. For others, it reads as trust. The movie assumes patience is not a flaw, but a skill, and it demands that skill in return. This places Snow White, 2025, in rare company among studio fantasy films. It shares more DNA with contemplative myth retellings than with blockbuster revisions. Think less reimagined classic, more ethical parable. The film doesn't ask, what should happen? It asks, what does this behavior produce over time? That's a fundamentally different narrative engine. The most subversive element may be how the film handles hope. Hope isn't framed as optimism or belief in happy endings. It's framed as refusal. Refusal to adopt the logic of domination, even when domination is efficient. Snow White doesn't win because she outmaneuvers the queen. She wins because she doesn't become her. That distinction sounds simple. It isn't. It requires endurance rather than brilliance, moral stamina rather than cleverness. This makes the film quietly confrontational. It suggests that many systems persist not because resistance fails, but because resistance becomes exhausted. The Queen's true weapon isn't magic, it's inevitability. Snow White breaks that spell not with rebellion, but with continuity. She keeps showing up, keeps listening, keeps choosing care when cruelty would be easier. The film frames this as radical, not naive. That framing has implications beyond the story. It reframes how we evaluate protagonists altogether. In contemporary cinema, agency is often measured by how quickly a character asserts control. Here, agency is measured by how long a character can remain ethically intact under pressure. That's a slower metric, harder to dramatize, but more resonant for viewers navigating real-world complexity rather than cinematic catharsis. It also explains why the film resists irony. There's no wink at the audience, no self-aware humor deflating sincerity. Snow White 2025 treats belief seriously, almost stubbornly. In a media environment saturated with detachment, that earnestness reads as either refreshing or unbearable, depending on taste. The film makes no attempt to soften that divide. What's striking is how confidently it holds that line. There's no late pivot toward spectacle to earn attention, no last-minute escalation to reassure skeptics. The film ends the way it lived, quietly, deliberately, unresolved. That consistency may be its greatest strength and its biggest commercial liability. Viewed this way, Snow White 2025 feels less like a crowd pleaser that missed the mark and more like a controlled experiment. What happens if a studio fairy tale prioritizes ethical coherence over adrenaline? What if legacy IP is used not to comfort, but to question? The film doesn't answer whether this approach is profitable. It answers whether it's possible. And that possibility matters. Because even if Disney never repeats this exact experiment, the precedent exists. A live-action remake that refuses to perform nostalgia. That treats myth as living argument rather than frozen icon. That allows disagreement to exist without apology. Over time, this may become the film's true influence. Not imitation, but permission. Permission for future storytellers to slow down, to trust silence, to let restraint do the work spectacle usually handles. Influence doesn't always announce itself through franchises. Sometimes it seeps sideways into craft decisions, tonal risks, narrative patience. This is how certain films age well despite initial resistance. They don't chase relevance, they wait for it. As cultural noise cycles faster, works built on steadiness gain contrast. Snow White 2025 may never be reclaimed as misunderstood genius. It doesn't need that narrative. It may simply become useful. A reference point for what happens when a fairy tale chooses ethics over excitement. And that usefulness opens the door to the next question, not what the film is, but what it allows us to imagine next. Because once a story refuses to resolve power cleanly, it invites us to keep thinking. Fairy tales survive because they are retold, but they endure because they are reinterpreted. Snow White 2025 understands that difference instinctively. It isn't interested in preserving a story's surface. It's interested in stress, testing its moral architecture. And in doing so, it asks a question most remakes avoid. What happens when a myth outgrows the reassurance it once provided? The original Snow White emerged from a world that needed clarity. Good and evil were cleanly separated. Reward followed virtue. Punishment followed vanity. The 2025 film emerges from a world that no longer experiences power that way. Systems persist. Villains rarely announce themselves. Moral choices are cumulative rather than climactic. This version of the story doesn't update details to match the present. It updates assumptions. That's why the film feels quieter than its legacy suggests it should. Noise implies certainty. This story operates in doubt. Snow White isn't certain she'll succeed. She isn't certain people will follow. She isn't even certain kindness will work. She chooses it anyway. That's not innocence. That's commitment. The film draws a sharp line between the two. This distinction matters because it reframes what strength looks like in mythic storytelling. Strength here isn't decisiveness. It's continuity. Snow White's defining trait isn't bravery in a single moment. It's consistency across many. She doesn't transform the world by winning a confrontation. She alters it by refusing to let cruelty dictate her behavior. The film suggests that power loses its grip not when it's challenged loudly, but when it's deprived of imitation. That's a difficult idea to dramatize, and the film never pretends otherwise. Progress feels slow. Resistance feels exhausting. Victory feels partial. But that difficulty is the point. Myths that promise easy moral math stop working when lived experience contradicts them. Snow White 2025 doesn't discard the myth. It recalibrates it for endurance rather than comfort. This recalibration places the film closer to oral tradition than cinematic spectacle. In oral storytelling, endings are rarely neat. They're instructive. They tell you how to behave when the story ends and life resumes. This Snow White doesn't tell you that goodness will be rewarded. It tells you goodness must be maintained. That's a heavier lesson. It's also a more honest one. There's a reason the film resists a coronation as triumph ending. Crowns imply completion. Authority implies resolution. The movie understands that installing a good ruler doesn't dismantle a system, it only changes its steward. Snow White's future is intentionally undefined because the work is ongoing. She doesn't inherit perfection. She inherits responsibility. In this sense, the film becomes less about Snow White as an individual and more about Snow White as a role. A posture. A way of inhabiting power without replicating harm. That role can be taken up by anyone. It's transferable. That's why the supporting ensemble matters so much. Change doesn't belong to a single figure. It diffuses outward. This diffusion is what ultimately separates Snow White 2025 from most modern revisions. Many remakes replace old certainty with new certainty, swapping moral frameworks without questioning the structure itself. This film questions the structure. It asks whether fairy tales can still function when certainty is replaced by responsibility. Its answer is cautious but affirmative. Not everyone wants that from a fairy tale, and that's okay. Fairy tales serve different needs at different times, but the existence of a version like this expands the genre's range. It proves that myth doesn't have to harden into nostalgia to remain relevant. It can soften into inquiry. Over time, this may become the film's most lasting contribution. Not its performances, not its controversies, not its box office trajectory, but its reframing of what adaptation is for. Not replication, not correction, but conversation. A conversation. Across expectations, across fears about what stories are allowed to become. And that leaves one final layer to examine. Not the film, but us. How we meet stories that refuse to comfort us. How we respond when myth stops soothing and starts asking something back. That's where this analysis ends. Every era gets the fairy tales it deserves, not the ones it wants, the ones it needs to wrestle with. Snow White 2025 arrives in a cultural moment defined by exhaustion. Exhaustion with spectacle, with outrage cycles, with heroes who win by overpowering rather than enduring. This film doesn't soothe that exhaustion, it reflects it. What makes the movie polarizing isn't its politics or its casting or its changes, it's its tempo. It asks viewers to slow down in a world that punishes slowness, to observe in a media ecosystem that rewards reaction. That alone is enough to create resistance. Modern audiences are trained to expect narrative acceleration as proof of value. This film denies that training. That denial reframes how responsibility is experienced while watching. The film doesn't carry you emotionally. It walks beside you. If you disengage, it doesn't chase you. If you lean in, it rewards patience with accumulation. Meaning builds through repetition, not revelation. For some viewers, that feels empty. For others, it feels respectful. This split reveals something important about contemporary storytelling expectations. Many viewers want stories to perform certainty, to reassure us that moral clarity still exists and can be achieved decisively. Snow White 2025 offers something more unsettling, moral clarity without moral closure. It suggests that goodness is not a destination, but a practice. That's harder to consume. It's also more honest. The film's reception exposes how uncomfortable we've become with ambiguity when it isn't packaged as prestige. Slow cinema gets a pass. Art house uncertainty is forgiven. But when ambiguity enters a fairy tale, especially a Disney one, it feels like betrayal to some audiences. The film violates an unspoken contract that fairy tales should protect us from complexity, not invite it in. Yet historically, fairy tales were never that gentle. Early versions were warnings, not comforts. They taught children how power operates, who gets punished, and why survival often depends on attention rather than strength. Snow White 2025 doesn't modernize the story. It restores its function. It becomes instructive again. That restoration helps explain why the film resonates more strongly with viewers encountering it outside the noise cycle. Without the expectation of comfort, the film's quiet ethics come into focus. Snow White's behavior, listening, waiting, refusing cruelty, reads not as passivity, but as discipline. Discipline is not glamorous, but it's sustainable. The film argues that sustainability is the real fantasy. This perspective also reframes the idea of strong female characters, a label so overused it's lost coherence. Strength here isn't expressed through dominance, sarcasm, or invulnerability. It's expressed through consistency under pressure. Snow White doesn't prove strength by winning. She proves it by not becoming what she resists. That's a harder narrative sell and a more radical one. In that sense, Snow White 2025 may be less about empowerment and more about stewardship. Stewardship of power, of narrative, of community. Those are not themes that trend. They persist. They outlast cycles. That's why the film feels oddly out of step with its moment and perfectly aligned with it at the same time. This duality is likely how the film will continue to be discussed. Not as a success or failure, but as a signal. A signal that audiences are no longer a monolith, that stories can choose coherence over consensus and still matter. That not every adaptation needs to justify itself through volume. The question isn't whether Disney will make more films like this. The question is whether audiences will continue to find them once the noise fades. Because films like Snow White 2025 don't announce their relevance. They wait for it. And that brings us to the final movement, not a verdict, but a closing reflection. Not on the film's place in history, but on the kind of stories we're willing to sit with when certainty stops selling. That's where this analysis ends. We arrive, finally, at the quietest place this analysis could end. Not with certainty, not with judgment, but with a recognition of what kind of story Snow White 2025 ultimately chose to be, and what that choice asks of us. This film does not want to be loved unanimously. It doesn't even want to be agreed with. It wants to be considered. That's a dangerous ambition in modern franchise cinema, where value is measured in velocity and consensus. But Snow White 2025 opts out of that economy. It trades immediacy for endurance. What lingers most isn't any single scene, performance, or line of dialogue. It's a posture, a way of moving through power without replicating it, a way of resisting cruelty without theatrical defiance. Snow White's greatest act isn't overthrowing a queen. It's refusing to let the logic of domination become contagious. That's a subtle victory. And subtle victories don't trend. This is why the film unsettles some viewers even after the credits roll. It doesn't give you permission to relax. It doesn't resolve anxiety into spectacle. Instead, it hands responsibility back to the audience. Now what is the question it leaves behind? Not wasn't that satisfying? In that sense, the film behaves less like entertainment and more like myth in its original function. Myths weren't designed to comfort. They were designed to orient, to offer frameworks for behavior when answers are incomplete. Snow White 2025 restores that function by stripping away guarantees. Goodness doesn't win because it deserves to. It survives because it persists. There's an honesty in that which feels increasingly rare, especially in stories aimed at younger audiences. The film doesn't lie about the cost of ethical behavior. It doesn't pretend kindness is efficient. It doesn't promise that listening will be rewarded quickly. What it offers instead is something quieter and more demanding. The idea that moral integrity is a long game. That idea will never be universally embraced. Nor should it be. Fairy tales don't exist to impose singular truths. They exist to evolve alongside the societies telling them. This version of Snow White reflects a moment defined by fatigue with absolutes and suspicion of spectacle. It speaks to viewers who feel the weight of systems rather than the thrill of victory. In time, the noise around this film will fade. The arguments will soften into footnotes. What will remain is a work that dared to slow down inside one of the loudest genres imaginable. A Disney fairy tale that trusted silence, that treated restraint as strength, that believed audiences could handle unresolved endings. Whether this becomes a template or an outlier is almost beside the point. Its existence alone expands the boundaries of what mainstream myth can attempt. It proves that reinterpretation doesn't have to shout to justify itself. It can whisper and wait. And waiting, in this film, is not surrender. It's strategy. So perhaps the most fitting way to understand Snow White 2025 is not as a replacement for the story we grew up with, but as a companion to it. One tale promises that goodness will be rewarded. The other warns that goodness must be maintained. Both are true, just at different stages of life. This Snow White isn't here to lull us to sleep. She's here to remind us to stay awake.